Good day, Junior Tikkies. I'm Mrs. Brimacombe. We're going to look now at manufacturing activity 2. 2.1 Ledger accounts and cost calculations. Outdoor furniture. The following information relates to outdoor furniture. Outdoor furniture manufactures wooden tables for outdoors. The information relates to the financial year ended 31 March 2022. Required: prepare the following accounts in the general ledger for the year ended 31 March 2022 and then calculate the gross profit earned for the financial year ended 31 March 2022. So starting with the raw materials stock account, this is an asset, which means that the opening balance will always appear on the debit side. They provided the opening balance to us, 23,500. Then, raw material stock at the end, they've given the balance 34,550. Balance brought down means balance carried down. So when the opening balance and the closing balance is given to you, you should know that I will need to calculate the raw materials issued. And raw materials issued is an expense which is closed off to direct material cost. So if we now look at the transactions, it says credit purchases of raw materials, which means our raw material stock account will increase because it's an asset. From the creditors journal, my details is creditors control. Cash purchases of raw materials, it means our raw material stock account will increase on the debit side. From the CPJ, my details is bank, 250,000. Paid cash for transport costs on raw materials. This means that this must be added to the raw material stock account. And if it's cash, from the CPJ, our details is bank, 14,250. Then it says defective raw materials return to the suppliers. This means we've taken some of it back, which means that our assets will decrease on the credit side. So from the creditors allowance journal, our details is creditors control and the amount was 8,600. Once we've now taken all the transactions to the raw materials stock account, we can calculate the raw materials issued, which will be the balancing figure. So if this is the balancing figure, it means that we need to add the debit side minus everything on the credit side, which means that the raw materials issued is 533,000. Now, immediately, this must be taken to the work in process stock account. The work in process stock account is an asset, which means on the debit side, we would always have the opening balance, which was given to you, 27,270. This account will always have my direct material cost, direct labor cost, and factory overhead cost, which will appear on the debit side. On the credit side, we will have the cost of finished goods produced this year, which is taken to the finished goods stock account, and the balance at the end. So, we've just calculated the raw materials issued, and we said that the raw materials issued is equal to your direct material cost. So now, before I can complete this account, I've got so many unknowns. We first need to find out what is the direct material cost, the direct labor cost and the factory overhead cost. So if we're looking at our direct labor cost, remember that all expenses must be closed off to a cost account. So when we're talking about salaries and wages, you should remember that the gross wage or the gross salary is an expense to the business. All the deductions is taken to a specific fund account, which is a liability. What we owe our employees, the net salary or the net wage, is a liability. And then the business can contribute towards the UIF, for example, towards the medical aid, towards the pension fund. that is an expense to the business. So when we're looking at direct labor cost, and the same as with my indirect labor cost, we need to look at the gross salary or the gross wage plus the contributions. So if I look at what has been given to me, they've provided me the basic wage plus the overtime equals the gross wage. Then the deductions, 7% towards the pension fund is deducted from the employee's salary and 1% towards the UIF. The employer contributes 9% towards the pension fund and 1% towards the unemployment insurance fund. So where do I start? We start with the wages. The gross wage is given to you. It's the basic plus overtime, 446,334. Then we need to look at the pension fund, but specifically the pension fund contributions. It's calculated on the basic wage, which means 9% of 420,000. UIF contribution is 1% of the basic wage, which means 420,000 times 1%. Now, if I add all of this together, this will equal my total direct labor cost, which must be taken to the work in process stock account. This means immediately in your work in process stock account, indicate direct labor cost, which you've calculated in the direct labor cost ledger account. For every credit, there's a debit. If we're looking now at our factory overhead cost, transactions during the year. Now remember, we've already done credit purchases of raw materials, cash purchases of raw materials, paid cash for transport cost, defective raw materials return. So what is left over is cash purchases of factory indirect materials. So that is the first one that we need to write as an indirect cost, which forms part of the factory overhead cost. And we write it in brackets. Production wages is not applicable here. This was calculated in direct labor cost. Then we've got rent expense. Make sure that you show the total in brackets, the amount. Insurance, 56,700. Water and electricity, 184,700. And factory sundry expenses, 49,669. So this is your step number 1. Then we need to look at the additional information. It says there that indirect materials used in the factory amounted to 22,450. So here they told you what was your total expense on factory overhead cost for indirect materials. So this will be my final amount. If I take what we've used and I subtract it from what we've purchased, that 1,300 is left over. That will go to the indirect materials stock account or consumables on hand. That was not required here. We need to know what was the total expense for this accounting period. Then it says indirect labor inclusive of benefits totaled 81,000. They did not provide us with indirect labor as transactions for the year. This means that we need to add this now to the factory overhead cost, 81,000. The rent expense must be apportioned between the factory, sales department, and the office in the ratio of 5 to 2 to 1. I don't care about the cost that goes to the sales department and the office department. I care about what forms part of my factory overhead cost. This means that we need to take the rent, 247,000 times 5 divided by 8. That equals my total rent expense. 80% of the water and electricity must be allocated to the factory. This means my water and electricity, we're going to times that by 80% to find out what was the total water and electricity spent in the factory. 2/3 of the insurance expense is for the factory. This means insurance, 56,700 times 2 divided by 3 equals my total expense for insurance in the factory overhead cost. During the year, 8,000 tables were produced at a cost of $189 per unit. Tables are sold at a fixed selling price of $300 each. That does have nothing to do with the factory overhead cost. This means that there's no change to the factory sundry expenses. So we can just write that which we've shown in brackets as our final amount. Our next step is to calculate our factory overhead cost, which should be taken to the work in process stock account. Again, the same as before. Immediately, once you have done calculating it, take it to the work in process stock account, which means that for every credit, there is a debit. If I now look at the work in process stock account, I still got two unknowns, which means that the balance at the end wasn't given. I cannot solve the finished goods stock account amount. This means our next step is to go and complete the finished goods stock T account. Although it wasn't required, I need to complete that in order for me to find out the work in process stock account. Or we just need to look at what is our options if we look at additional information. It says there, during the year, 8,000 tables were produced at a cost of $189. Tables are sold at a fixed selling price of 300 Rand each. So based on that, I can solve the finished goods stock amount, the total cost of goods produced or manufactured this year. What I'm going to do now, at the same time, while I'm solving that, I'm going to complete the next question that says calculate the gross profit earned for the financial year ended 31 March. Now, why am I completing the gross profit earned for the financial year ended 31 March? To calculate the gross profit, we need to take our sales minus cost of sales. And in a manufacturing business, our cost of sales is calculated in the finished goods stock account. So I'm going to open up the finished goods stock account T account. And I'm going to start with the balance brought down on the debit side, which was given to me, 39,690. That equals 210 tables. I want to find out the cost of finished goods produced, which is from the work in process stock account. The balance at the end was given to me, 45,360. Balance brought down means balance carried down. They said that equaled 240 tables. If I now work out the cost of finished goods produced this year, we're going to take 8,000 times 189, and this amount must be taken to the work in process stock account. Now we can calculate the end balance by taking the debit side minus the credit side, and that equals our balance of 29,658. So now we've completed the work in process stock account. To finish off, to calculate the gross profit earned, we can now calculate our cost of sales. To calculate our cost of sales, we take the debit side minus the credit side, and that equals the balancing figure, which is my cost of sales. If you take 210 plus 8,000 minus 240, it means that 7,970 units were sold, or tables. Why do I need this? I want to find out the total sales. So to find out my sales, they said it's a fixed selling price of 300 each. Take the number of units that you've sold times 300, that equals my sales. sales minus cost of sales equals my gross profit for this year. If you take 7,970 and you times that by 189, it will equal exactly the same amount. Question 2.2, Ponko manufacturers. Ponko manufactures toiletry travel bags. The information below is from their records for the financial year ended 31 March 2022. 2.2.1, verify the break-even number of units for the financial year ended 31 March 2022 by showing all calculations. And 2.2.2, comment on the break-even point and the level of production for both years. Quote relevant figures in your comment. So if we're looking at verifying the break-even point, how do we calculate the break-even point? It is your total fixed cost divided by the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit. Remember, selling price per unit minus variable cost per unit equals my contribution per unit. So we need to verify the break-even point. This means we're going to take our total fixed cost divided by the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit, which is our contribution per unit. That means 300,000 divided by 25 equals 12,000. So this is just another way of asking the break-even point. They provided it to you. Now you just need to verify that that was correctly calculated. To comment on the break-even point and the level of production for both years. When we're commenting, we have to compare the break-even point from last year to this year. We compare the number of units produced and sold from last year to this year. And then we compare the break-even point with the number of units produced and sold for each year to see if we made a profit or a loss. Did we break even? Did we cover our cost? So if we're starting with the number of units produced and sold. Last year, the number of units produced and sold was 11,800. And it was the same as the break even, which means that the business didn't make a profit, they didn't make a loss. They just managed to cover their cost. If we compare that to 2022, the number of units produced and sold was 12,480, which was 480 units more than the break-even point. This means from last year to this year, we went from making no profit to this year at least making a profit of 480 units. If we want to find out, but what was that profit equal to? To find that out, you have to take 480 times the contribution per unit, which is 25. So 480 times 25 means that the business made a profit of 12,000. When comparing now the number of units produced and sold, it increased from 11,800 units in 2021 to 12,480 units in 2022. So that's an increase of 680 units, which is 5.8%. Looking at the break-even point, it increased from 11,800 units to 12,000, an increase of 200 units, which is 1.7%. It is very important that you understand how to comment on the break-even point and the number of units produced and sold. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to look at activity 3. I want to leave you with this quote. Never say, I can't, always say, I'll try. Have a wonderful day.